Hey, so I'm back with round 6 of my recent tournament, the Bay Area International. So in round 6, I was paired against Rochelle Wu, who's about 2150 and quite a talented player. I think she's 11 or 12 now, but she was the under 10 world champion a few years ago. So this was definitely felt like it was gonna be a tough game. I was playing black, and I think she surprised me with playing G3 in the opening. At least I hadn't seen any games before where she played the Fianchetto King's Indian. So I was not expecting this and not really prepared. But okay, it's not the first time I'm seeing G3 over the board, so I was still kind of okay here. And we went for one of the main lines in the position, and I went for knight c6, castles, and e5. Lately, this has been a super popular line for black, so I decided to try it here. I think this is my first time playing it in a tournament game, though I've played it like online before and stuff. Okay, so now white has a choice between taking on e5 and pushing d5. White pushed d5 here. I went back knight b8. This is all kind of theory. From here, black tries to play a5, knight a6, and put the knight on c5. Actually, not always. A lot of times this knight comes back to d7 and ends up going to c5 as well. Okay, so white played e4, a5, knight e1, knight a6, knight d3. She was playing pretty quickly here, so I figured she was probably in preparation. But then she played this move f4, which to me definitely feels like is not the best move in the position, and pretty clearly. So I don't know, maybe it was kind of an impulsive move because I think she played this one relatively quickly. But yeah, not sure. I think white should probably just play bishop e3, and there's still theory here. Usually black just plays f5, and we get a pretty complicated game. But okay, I would have been pretty satisfied with this. So the problem with f4 is that after black takes on f4, we've opened up the dark squared bishop, and black really gets a lot of play, especially against white's pawn on c4, because now we have this idea to play knight to b6. The pawn on c4 is hanging, and white can't play b3 because the knight on c3 is going to be hanging as well. So this idea with ef4 kind of introduces all of these like weaknesses into white's position. Now here white took with the bishop. In previous games, white would take with the pawn here, and I think the best move was probably just to play f5. And then if white takes, black should take with the rook and kind of keep a small structural advantage, and then we can play against the f4 pawn, we can play against the c4 pawn, and I think black is just already kind of slightly better here. But okay, bishop takes f4 is definitely logical, and now I just felt like we're playing somewhat of a Benoni type structure, with this square on e5 being firmly in black's control. And I figured since white is going to maybe try to play like rook e1 and e5, then it would be a good idea to play knight to b4 and try to exchange off this knight on d3, which I think makes a lot of sense. I have a little bit less space as well, and I have like two knights that want to be on the c5 square, so it makes sense to trade this one off and then put my other knight on c5. Or potentially e5 as well. Okay, so already I felt very comfortable here. I just felt like black is having like very clear counterplay, and the structure is really good. White's bishop on g2 is not a great piece at all. But okay, white played h3, and then I played knight to b6. So yeah, now I'm not sure about this move. I think I should have just gone with the simpler knight takes d3, queen takes d3, and then something like a4. And this is a pretty typical idea for black, just to advance this pawn and prevent white from being able to play b3 and achieve some kind of solidity on the queen side. Then black wants to again put the knight on c5, and then maybe even play a3 in some positions and look for some dynamic chances there. But I went for knight b6 because I thought it was kind of an interesting idea. White can't play b3 still, can't take on b4 because I'll recapture and I'll be hitting the knight. So she played the only move here, a3. Now I'm forced to take on d3, queen takes d3, and I pushed a4. And so I felt like I've already forced white to commit to playing a3 here. That means the b3 square is kind of a long-term weakness now, and then when I bring my knight back to d7 and on c5, I've already kind of taken control over the b3 square. So I thought this was kind of a nice achievement. But maybe my advantage here is not that huge. It's more of a kind of long-term pressure I'm playing for. But it ended up working out in this game. Okay, so rook c1, knight d7, rook c2, and I played queen to e7. Now I'm kind of inviting this move knight to b5, but I'm going to have a tempo with knight e5 or knight to c5 here in response. So instead, white played queen to d2. I decided to put the knight on e5, hitting the c4 pawn. White played knight to b5, and I played bishop d7. So now I'm using some tactics here to develop my bishop. White could take on c7, but it's very risky because after rook a c8, the knight has to go back to b5, and black can take on c4. So the line doesn't exactly end here. White could even play rook takes c4, and then bishop takes d6. But in the resulting position, I think black ends up in, really good shape. Let's say queen d8, bishop takes f8, queen takes f8, knight has to go back and b5. So I was analyzing this a little bit with Stockfish, and black is down a pawn, but is threatening b4 in the next move, and then the queen is going to come in, and it just seems like black has a ton of play against white's queenside, and the bishop on g7 in particular is extremely strong here. Once we get this trade like a b4, queen b4, I'm also threatening a3 here just to completely undermine white's knight. So yeah, things were definitely not clear there, but at least during the game I definitely hadn't calculated all that far, and I wasn't exactly sure what was going on, but I think black is probably doing quite well. Probably white should have played this move bishop to g5, which is a little bit awkward for black to me. It forces f6 and then just drop back with bishop f4. And now my bishop on g7 would be blocked. Of course, at a certain point, I'm just going to play f5 and open it up anyway, but for the time being, I have to play with this like passive bishop on g7. So from white's point of view, it definitely improves the position a little bit and makes it a little bit more difficult for black to play. Instead, white played this move knight to d4, which I think is pretty consistent, just improving the knight, putting it on this square, and now the c4 pawn is well guarded. But this allows black to play c5, which I felt like was quite an achievement. So white doesn't have to capture en passant here. She could just return either with knight e2 or knight f3 here. But then I think black is just getting a fantastic Benoni. I can probably immediately play b5 and then get my bishop into the game, and it seems just super active position for black. Definitely a good version of these kinds of positions. So white takes en passant, b takes c6. Now I felt like my d6 pawn is definitely becoming a target, but I also get the open b file, so I felt like this was pretty useful anyway. Bishop g5 was played, f6, and probably bishop f4 here was best, just to go back and keep the bishop eyeing the d6 pawn. But white instead played bishop e3, and then I pushed c5. So this move is a little bit anti-positional because I'm giving up the d5 square, but I felt like wherever the knight goes, I'm going to be able to cover d5 pretty quickly. The critical line I thought was knight to e2 here, trying to play, let's say, knight f4 and then knight to d5. But white's not really in time here. I can play bishop to e6, hitting the c4 pawn. And if rook fc1, I have this nice tactic, bishop takes h3. The point is, okay, bishop takes knight f3 check is a fork and winning the queen. White can continue with like knight f4 here, but if nothing else, black can just pull back bishop e6, and I think black is just a pawn up and has a nice advantage here. Or I can also trade bishops on g2, and then after king takes g2, knight f7. This is a nice idea, just covering the d6 pawn and hitting e4 as well, and black is a pawn up and just much better. White has still like a lot of weaknesses in the position. So white isn't really in time to make use of this d5 square weakness. Instead, white played knight to f3, and I decided to trade knights. So this ends up being a little bit hasty. I think actually in hindsight I should have just played knight f7, covering my weak pawn on d6 and preparing to move bishop c6 and then rook a e8, and the e4 pawn is a big target. Very easy for black to attack this one. So black would have had a serious advantage there. After knight takes f3, rook takes f3, bishop c6, I felt like I'm getting the same pressure against the e4 pawn, so I didn't see the harm in trading knights, and in my mind I was actually trying to just play this very technically, just playing against white's weaknesses, not really looking to create a sharp or messy position. But white played this phase pretty well. Bishop f4, just counterattacking d6, and I definitely underestimated this whole idea, so I was kind of fortunate that black can even continue playing for a win here. But tactics are kind of on my side in this position. After rook d8, rook d3 was played. Now the d6 pawn is definitely a goner, but okay, at this point I already started calculating some things, and I figured out that bishop takes e4 is definitely just black's best move here. Okay, so white cannot take on d6 here because I have rook takes d6, rook takes d6, and then I grab the second rook on c2, and then white can't recapture because queen takes d6, so black is just going to be piece up here. Instead, after bishop takes e4, white doesn't want to take on e4 because then my queen gets in, and this is just very active and annoying especially for white's king. And next I just want to play f5 and bishop to d4, which looks really, really dangerous. Instead, white played rook to e3. And I was kind of anticipating this one, and f5. Now white takes on e4, f takes e4, and gives queen d5 check, and is winning back the e4 pawn. So at first glance it looks like white is probably totally okay here, but I felt like even in this endgame I am going to have a lot of long-term ideas based on targeting this weak pawn on b2. So like all the way back in the opening I made it a point to fix this pawn on a4 and kind of fix this pawn as a long-term weakness, and finally it's actually coming to fruition a little bit, because eventually I just want to bring my rook to the b file and kind of pile up. So things are not so easy for white. So according to the engine, rook takes e4 here. This would have actually kind of held the balance. During the game I wanted to trade queens and give a check on d4, and if I'm allowed to play rook f5 in the next move, then it seems like I'm just going to be winning a pawn. But white has this move bishop e3, and taking the endgame into a rook endgame gives white quite a lot of chances to hold the draw. Even if white ends up going down a pawn, active rooks always provide a lot of compensation. But here I don't think white is even losing material, because eventually white is going to be able to go after the a4 pawn. So had white found this, I think the game would have been just very close to reaching something that's pretty drawish, and likely would have finished in a draw. Instead, white took on f7, which seems like it's going to be the same thing, but the structure is actually somewhat better for black, because after king takes f7, it's not possible for white to really get to the a4 pawn, but the d6 pawn is a lot easier for black to defend, and a lot less important too. So king takes f7, rook takes e4, and I played rook e8. And I realized that I'm actually very happy to trade rooks here, because if we get rook takes e8, king takes e8, I'm just simply going to be putting my king on c6. Eventually my bishop's going to come to d4. My d6 pawn will be totally covered. I'll play rook to b8 and then maybe even rook to b3. And white is just going to have a very tough time defending everything. The bishop might have to go back to c1 to cover the b2 pawn, but then my rook can try and focus on the kingside pawns. I might even have a move like bishop e5 there and hitting the g3 pawn with my rook on b3. Okay, a lot of ideas, but it's actually just like a very systematic advantage for black. Just king goes to c6, bishop d4, rook comes in, and white has a ton of weaknesses and isn't really able to create counterplay. So I was feeling very excited by this, but my concept wasn't exactly 100% sound. So here white played rook e2, which I think was a very smart move, just keeping the king cut along the e-file. I decided to trade rooks, and then I played this move rook to e8. So during the game I thought this move was winning, but then I had some doubts, and afterwards I was analyzing, and it turns out that this move is not winning, and actually white can make a draw here, I think, with really precise play. So the critical line seems to be what happens after white trades rooks, king takes, and just takes the pawn on d6. So first of all, if I take on b2 here, I'm just not in time. White can take on c5 and is just a healthy pawn up. Instead, the idea was actually to plant the bishop on d4 with check, and then after king to f1, I still can't take on b2, but I really want to, and then take on a3. I just need to play king d7 first. So king d7, bishop has to move, king to c6, and this was kind of my idea during the game. I defend the c5 pawn with my king, and then white is never able to defend the b2 pawn with the bishop, just never able to get back in time. So I thought during the game this position was winning, because I'm taking on b2, I'm taking on a3, my bishop is coming back to b2, and then I'm just promoting the pawn. But white's king is actually in time to stop this pawn, and then that position turns out is probably not winning. Let's say g4 here, bishop takes a3, king to d3. And let's say I put my bishop on b4. I actually thought this might be the most challenging attempt. King c2, a3, and king to b3. So this is kind of the critical position. It looks like black has everything steady. All we need to do is bring the king in. But the problem is, if I try to get the king into the game, white's structure is actually set up perfectly to keep it out. So the bishop comes back to f4, takes over the e5 and g5 squares. The g-pawn covers the light squares, the c-pawn covers the other squares, and my king simply has no ways to get in. If I play something like h5, white should definitely just ignore it and, let's say, move the king, king a2, or a move like bishop h2. And yeah, I was drawing some arrows here. I thought a potential winning plan was to play bishop d2 and then bring it to d4 and e5, but it's just way too slow. White will immediately take the a3 pawn, and then black it'll take me a very long time to be able to do anything, and white is just going to be completely fine there. So yeah, during the game I thought this endgame was, if not winning, then at least provided good chances. But it turns out it was probably just a draw. So that means, from my point of view, I definitely shouldn't have made this move rook e8. I mean, eventually I won the game, so it didn't end up mattering, but objectively this was definitely a mistake. Instead, I should have just given the check right away. White probably plays king to g2, and then a move like king f6, just trying to slowly bring in my king, maybe even preparing a move like bishop e5. Then if white trades, I can take with the pawn, improve my structure, and my rook is still going to be able to get in, and I'll still be pretty active there. And black should have, I think, good winning chances. Okay, so after rook e8, white really should have traded on e8, and objectively that position was likely drawn. But I think my opponent just kind of believed me on this one. You know, since I played this move rook e8 and I'm offering the trade, it seems like I've already calculated that everything is winning. And to my credit, I did think that I was winning in that position. The problem is that I was just, you know, kind of mistaken and leading with false confidence. So yeah, white kind of, well, I mean, probably thought that they were just losing there anyway, so decided to keep the rooks on the board and fight for more chances this way. But now I get to play bishop d4 check, king f1, and rook to b8. So white could take the d6 pawn here again. Then the plan was to play rook to b6, bishop has to go back to f4, and then probably rook to b3. I don't want to take on b2 yet with the rook, because I'd rather take with the bishop, then take on a3 with the bishop, keep the rooks on the board, and then black is the one who has a lot more winning chances there. The bishop comes back to b2, and then the pawn should be able to just run forward. So white instead tried the move king to e2. This allows me to play king e6 and just bring in my king. Bishop e3 was played. I keep the bishops on the board because now my bishop, I think, is just too strong, just kind of attacking everything. g3, b2, a3. White could play a move like bishop f4 here. And I'm not exactly sure what I would have done during the game. I think I would have... oh yeah, I think I was just going to take on b2 here, because if bishop takes e5, I can first trade rooks and then go into the king and pawn endgame with an extra pawn. And if rook takes b2, bishop takes b2, well, now I'm getting 2 extra pawns in this endgame because I'm winning this one, and then I can play d5 and just win the game easily. So yeah, it's basically hopeless here. Okay, white played g4, then I took on b2, and it was resigns because this is move 40. We reached the time control, and yeah, I'm just getting the same bishop endgame but 2 pawns up, so completely winning. Okay, so yeah, it was definitely nice to get back into it with a win. Obviously, it wasn't flawless, as I did allow multiple moments for white, not just equalize, but like reach a drawn position. But a win is a win. I can't really complain with that one. It got me back into the tournament, and it was kind of nice to get back on track. From what I remember, this game took place on a Saturday. I think it was definitely a new day in the tournament. It wasn't one of the double round days. So it was kind of nice to, let's say, go to the round, you know, fresh, like for a new day. I actually pretended that the last 4 rounds of this tournament were kind of like a new tournament, you know, altogether. Just some random 4-round tournament. The past is the past, and I tried to just forget it and treat the next 4 rounds as like something new. And I think that helped a little bit because I think played with a little bit more stability in the next few games. But okay, we'll see how that turns out. Thanks a lot for tuning in. Make sure to subscribe, and I'll see you guys next time. Take care.